Midweek Analysis with Harlan Dane Fallon, Danny Rowe and Bobby McClellan.
96.5 Bolton FM.
Very, very special, esteemed guest from the world of sports psychology, talking all things sports science, all things sports psychology, and relating a lot of his exclusive and intuitive knowledge in sports psychology to your football club, Bolton Wanderers, and seeing if you can, well, cross some of the T's and dot some of the I's, it is fair to say. Paul Russell is joining us very, very soon. I hope so. Paul, welcome to the show. You absolute legend.
Hiya, mate. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm absolutely chuffed that you've asked me to come on, so thank you.
For those that don't know who Paul is, because I've introduced you as Paul, you are Mr. Paul Russell, of course, an ex-tutor of mine at the University of Bolton, but you were a lot more than just that, Paul. Do you want to tell the listeners tonight, you know, who you are and how qualified you are and how much of a legend in the world of psychology you are?
Yeah, I'm a sport performance psychologist. I taught Harlan many years ago at the university when I was a lecturer there. I work in a lot of different sports. I worked at the English Institute of Sport, helping prepare different sports and different athletes for Olympic Games. So I did that for a few Olympic cycles. Worked in professional football, loads of different clubs, lots of individual players. First team psychologist for a Premier League club. Professional cricket, professional rugby, a lot of combat sports, specifically boxing and MMA. I've been fortunate enough to work with some really good people in those sports as well. So a bit of a mixture of a bit of everything, really.
And of course, you've been working with referees as well at PGOML. So obviously, very, very high profile gig, Paul. Obviously, completely understand that that is a very protected environment, of course. So won't pry into any of those details.
No, that's cool. I'd forgotten about that.
But what I can ask you is, you know, what is it like to work at that level of football under pressure? And you know, you are the man in theory that is helping people alleviate that pressure through psychological work and techniques that you can provide them with to deal with everyday life alongside sport, aren't you?
Yeah, and Premier League football is probably one of the biggest sports franchises in the world. The amount of attention it gets globally is just phenomenal. So yeah, I've worked a lot with players, helping them deal with pressure. It was interesting there what Adam were talking about. You know, when a player goes through a bad trot, and you know, he's obviously got the lived experience of how he helps players with that, and throughout his career, and you know, there's some real good stuff what he spoke about then. And I've got the experience. I was at PGMO where I was head of performance psychology and mental health. And there was a team of 4 other psychologists who were there as well. So we worked with match officials from UEFA, Premier League, Championship, Football League, Women's Super League. And the amount of pressure that they're under when they're making decisions is just phenomenal. That was just kind of, that was a real insight for me, working with match officials.
Absolutely amazing. Obviously, I remember you tutoring me in psychology. It's actually funny, Paul, because I actually went, you know, as you do when you're going through an old cupboard, and you know, not saying old cupboard, a cupboard that everything is stocked up in nicely and neatly. And
Have you found some essays that you still owe me?
No, submitted them. Hey, you were the one that gave me the highest grades, Paul. You were the one that gave me my highest grades in year 2 and year 3. It's actually quite odd, this, actually, that I'm talking to someone that I was relying on giving me marks for my degree on the radio tonight and asking you to tell us all about your amazing career, Paul. Feels quite surreal, actually. But you were always brilliant with us, and just to link it to the university, Paul, you know, how much did you translate from the world of sport to university in terms of, I felt it as a student, but how did you find using the psychological training you'd had to keep students motivated and to keep students stress-free in a university environment? Because that's an interesting thing that you'd worked in both environments, in high-profile sport and also in a university institute as well.
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, when I were a lecturer at the university, I did have quite a lot of applied experience, and I like to bring that into like the lecture room or classroom, because I think people, when they're learning, they want examples of real life stuff, and what you read in a book is one thing, but then having hopefully being able to discover what that theory looks like in the real world, or how you'd use it in real life. I hope that really sparks an interest with students, rather than it just being a bit like old school where you just kind of sit and listen and stuff like that. I really wanted to get people's opinions and thoughts and their experiences, and hopefully give them some of my experiences, and make it make it interesting and exciting for people, because I think when people are excited and interested in something, they work harder and they enjoy it.
Absolutely. I think, the unique thing there is that we were able to get Adam on with yourself tonight, and straight away, one after the other, we're now going to be able to further understand some of the stuff that Adam was talking about. In terms of that motivation, Paul, and focusing on your own challenges and your own targets and goals, one thing I didn't ask Adam then was, and you'll have dealt with players that have had to do this, they're the leading goal scorer, they're leading the line. In the end, they're the people that put the ball in the onion bag, and they're the ones who, in the end, are relied on more so than everybody else, even though anyone can score a goal on a football pitch, including the goalkeeper, to sustain a certain level of performance, like when Adam was at Reading and they went up with an unbelievable points tally. How hard is it to do that, and also put your arm around your teammate as well, and then obviously have a manager who is also got his own voice and who is the main man in the dressing room as well? It's a lot to compute for players, because they want to give advice to people and themselves, but then the manager's asking different things, and then if they've got a psychologist, your job is to try and give them the stress management and the strategies to kind of compartmentalise it all, isn't it, really?
Yeah, look, in an ideal world, everyone would be on the same page and have a real clarity about, as a player, what's expected of me when I go out, what do I need to do, and it's real. You speak to some coaches and managers, and they've got a great insight with players, and to be able to understand the difference between a player who needs a bit of reassurance as opposed to the player who needs telling them in no uncertain terms, in order to motivate them and get the best out of them. Because if you get that wrong, you can destroy them. I've been there several times. You come in at half time and it's not gone particularly well, and the manager might be telling the players, quite harshly what needs to be done, but then they want the players to go out and perform again, and they might have just had 10 minutes kind of really harsh criticism, doubting themselves, going out a bit unsure about what their actual role is. So it's about really understanding your players, because if I talk a lot with athletes about, if we use the football example, do you go out and play with fear or with freedom? And although that's a very simple thing to say, it's a lot more difficult thing, when you're out there on the pitch.
I remember you saying that to us at uni, actually. You were teaching us the theories of that, and I remember you talking about that, actually, yeah. Yeah,
and, someone who goes out and plays with freedom, they're far more confident. They play without thinking, they make the correct decisions at the right time. As soon as you start playing with fear, you're hesitant, you're scared of making a mistake, you think things aren't going to happen, you lose your confidence, and it's a very difficult cycle when players get stuck in that playing with fear type mentality, and that, a lot of my work as a psychologist is about helping them understand maybe where that fear comes from and how to cope with it, and how they can kind of get rid of that fear when they get on the pitch, and play with that freedom. make good decisions, do the right things, have confidence that they can be successful. Because in any sport, especially at the elite levels of sport, it is really challenging. It is really brutal at times. So even the most confident of players will struggle in that area at some point, just because of the demands that are put on them.
Very interesting stuff. Very, very interesting stuff, Chris. Obviously, you can tell how qualified Paul is with just how he's speaking right now. Have you got anything you would like to maybe ask Paul, especially regarding this season, which we're going to touch on very soon, Paul? Now, we're not asking you to kind of talk about something that maybe you've not had eyes on all season per se in terms of football club, but anything that we speak about that you are able to give us any scientific background on, or anything that we maybe bring to the fore, because I know football fans and people that are debating football sometimes can question things, but they don't really understand what's going on, like you've just alluded to, behind closed doors. They're not aware why a player's come out sauntering and not fully motivated because they're playing on fear and not freedom, as you eloquently said, Paul. And also, we have opinions on things sometimes, but we don't understand the science behind what might be going on. So we'll touch on Bolton very soon. And if you want to jump on any of that, Paul, and give us the scientific knowledge, that'd be amazing. Chris, anything you want to bring to the conversation, mate?
In all honesty, I think the one thing I'd like to ask is, Paul, when it comes to one-off matches, say a player final or a cup final, and it doesn't go according to plan, how tough would you say it is for a player or a group of players to have to recover physically and mentally from knowing that it hasn't gone according to plan, and now they have to prepare themselves for the following campaign where they're not where they want to be, so to speak?
I think there's 2 points there. There's one when, you kind of have maybe an unexpected defeat, and then you've got a week for the next game to get over it and get on. But then there's the other one, like you said, you have maybe a disappointing season, and then you've got to go again next season. And that's really where the skill of the manager comes in. I always think the closed season's a really good time to kind of regroup and kind of, get the players in pre-season. You get real clarity about what you want to achieve and how you're going to achieve it. And so everyone's really clear on what they want to do. Because when they go through a massive disappointment, say, like you say, about, say, missing out on playoffs or losing an important game, it's almost like a bit of a grieving process. And I'm not comparing it to that, but the process is very similar. Where you go through that, you might be angry, you might get frustrated, you might be blaming, well, it was the referee's fault, or if they'd have scored that goal, then we wouldn't have lost, or the keeper had saved that. Yeah. And psychologically, it's a very, very similar process. And you can view that sort of thing without dramatising it. You can view those big disappointments as kind of like little traumas. And how they overcome those traumas and effectively be able to park those things and then crack on and get back on track for what they need to do. And again, that's a real tough thing, because we can really, as human beings in general, not just athletes, but as human beings, we often cling on to the things that cause us the most distress. And the things that make us happy, or the things when we've achieved, we kind of let those go quite quickly.
Yeah, we were talking, Paul, weren't we, last week, actually, aside from this. It links very well with the point you just alluded to, Paul, about highs and people wanting to sustain the highs. So you always want to make sure that the adrenaline and the highs feel as high as they can possibly feel all the time. But we were speaking last week, weren't we, about this, and saying that you would actually feel more physically drained and mentally drained if you were always on that constant high of success than being able to take a step back and actually appreciate, maybe when you're not necessarily succeeding, what the success actually looked like and how it felt, so that you can get ready to go and achieve that again. And I think we do become obsessed in everyday life, aside from sport, don't we, Paul, with success, that we actually never really see what that looks like in in a mentally tangible way.
No, and look, I'm a great believer that, like, if we use football as an example, you play on your Saturday, you have your game. I'm a great believer that the feedback process after the game should be the same regardless of whether you win or lose. Because sometimes we'll go over the top when we get beat, and sometimes we'll if we've won, everything's fine, so we don't really have to chat about it. But I think there's so much we can learn by understanding what did we do on Saturday that made us win. What did we really nail on Saturday? What do we need to take from that game? What have we learned about our strengths in that game that we can take forward into the next game? And kind of look at it from that perspective, rather than just kind of looking at it, well, don't do this, don't do that. Look at, right, well, say the opposition scored first. What did we do really well in the first 5 minutes after they scored?
Yeah.
You know, how much impact do you feel like social media has nowadays, obviously? And I know, speaking from experience, you know, when Bolton had lost a playoff final, you know, it became a toxic place, you know, till the start of the season. How much do you think that has an impact on
I think it goes back to what I said before, you know.
Yeah.
We cling on to the thing that beats us up. And every player knows when they go on social media, the chances are there's going to be all sorts of views on there. And a lot of the time it's not right positive.
Yeah, I think you know. I think what you've said, Paul, is exactly what happened after the Oxford playoff final last year. You know, it's almost a year ago, and there was a real footballing hangover from that, and it felt to us as broadcasters that have spent a lot of time covering Bolton this season and in previous years, that it was the first time we really saw it continue into the next season, and never really seemed to ever, you know, distance itself from the group. I did obviously want to ask you a few specific questions that link with that, Paul. And one of the big questions to link to what Cian was saying then is, you know, the psychology of players hitting a barren run, and we did speak to Adam about it a short while ago. If a player has got 11 goals, for example, or two players have got 11 goals, especially this season in the likes of McAtee and Aaron Collins, and then they're the men leading the line, linking back to what I was saying before, and the teammates are then relying on them to go, don't matter, they'll keep scoring because we need them to keep scoring because they're the guys that are going to get us into the playoffs. And then it stops because then players have maybe felt that pressure, or maybe the manager changed and the philosophy is slightly different and the system is slightly changed at a time where really it had to because the board wanted it to, but it couldn't really change because now everybody has fallen apart in terms of mindset. How does that all manifest?
It's a really good example. And one of the things that I worked on at a club was about how there's a thing in psychology called contagion. Basically, it's a posh word for something being contagious. And so if you have someone who's struggling or someone who's gets frustrated if you concede a goal, and that can kind of spread around the team. If you've got, you know, I'm sure you can think of examples at different clubs whereby, you know, they've had some big players at the club who haven't necessarily been best for the club, and other players kind of go along with that narrative. And you have to be really careful about how these things spread. And so it doesn't take a whole team to be struggling, but like you say, you know, all of a sudden you say like McAtee, for instance, say he stops scoring, everyone starts looking around, going, well, and they start thinking, well,
where the goal's coming from.
Struggling. Then all of a sudden I'm struggling, and you know, I start to second guess myself. Do I still play the ball early to him, or do I keep it a bit longer, or you know, and those little micro things all add up. And I think that's where, you know, the psychologist, the manager, or whatever, really needs to work alongside the players, because you want the momentum to be in a positive direction. And so when you've got players struggling, if if a team's on a barren run or a losing streak, it's obviously very easy to get a bit pessimistic and lose a bit of confidence.
As has happened this season, of course, as it progressed.
And if that's not addressed, it spreads. It's that contagion thing, and it'll spread throughout the team. And it's about, who is that person who's responsible for, just kind of refocusing them. That actually, a defeat is a defeat. 2 defeats is 2 defeats. Doesn't mean we're rubbish. Doesn't mean we're useless. Doesn't mean our season's ruined. Because when we're struggling in those moments, we often lose a sense of perspective. So, you go 1-0 down. Oh, here we go again. We can't win this now. And it becomes like like you say, it is pessimistic, and we're all guilty of it, watching our own sides, of course, but at times. Yeah. But then because you're not always conscious when you think it, are you? It's subconscious. No. And then when you actually rationalise it at half time, you go and get that brew, or you go and get that coffee, and you're talking to the missus, or you're talking to your pals, or you're watching the game with, or you're in the ground talking to the person that you've sat next to for the last 15 seasons, and he's always the one to put his arm around you, or you round him, or her, or whatever, and you go, do you know what? Now I've had 5 minutes to calm down and watch somebody try and put a ball through a tyre that's hung off a crossbar, or run the length of the pitch with a silly outfit on, I actually feel a lot better about this second half now. And that's just from a fan perspective, and I think it's that. Would you? I remember you saying to us, Paul, at university, about taking yourself out of that situation for a minute and almost not obsessing about it, to the point where then you can almost refocus with a clear mind. Maybe you used to say to us, the workload at university is very, very heavy, but don't be afraid of taking breaks and allowing yourself to come back with a fresh mind. And I think it is very relatable to sport, isn't it? Because it's so high profile and so pressurised. Yeah, and again, if we use a football example, football's a 24-hour thing if you're a footballer. So when do you take your break, or when do you kind of mentally reset? If you're not playing football, you're training. If you're not training, you're thinking about it. If you're not thinking about it, someone's talking to you about it. And you need to have the courage to be able to, and the awareness to be able to understand, well, I need a little break here, or I need a little reset, or a little refocus, and just take a step away. Just think, right, what's actually going on here? Not get caught up in the emotion of it. Because when you're in the middle of it, you're just running on emotion.
Absolutely.
So can I take a step back? Can I just think what's actually happening? Can I just think what's the solution? What's going to make this situation better?
Absolutely.
All right, it's this. Right, get back on track.
Yeah. Cian, obviously this season, Bolton have had a tough time with injuries, of course, and sometimes from a fan perspective, it can almost be seen as a bit of an excuse from whoever's in charge, whoever's doing the press conferences. Chris obviously interviews the manager on a regular basis. But sometimes it just is how it is. The manager is struggling to select a side that he believes can beat a certain opponent, not because he doesn't believe in his players, just because he believes that with the calibre of player he's got in that moment in certain positions, they may be not going to be able to get the desired result, but they'll give it absolutely everything. But as fans, it's just an excuse. Injuries, we are, and in this case, we are Bolton Wanderers. We are a massive football club, which they are. But in that moment, you're not the strongest Bolton Wanderers you can be at the level you are currently playing at. And it's not easy sometimes for fans to comprehend, and we're all football fans. But at the same time as well, players, I always remember a phrase, Paul, if you tell a football player he's injured, he's injured. And there's the other side of it as well, where with the physiological developments now and the sports science developments, of course, I studied it, you obviously were a tutor of mine within that degree. It's very different to how it was back in the day now, where you can't just strap it up and get on with it. But us football fans would still have you believe that that's all we want, wouldn't we? But it all feeds into the same thing of, the success this season now is at risk because we've got a lot of injuries. And it's how do I motivate the rest of the lads to carry the can for the lads that are out?
Yeah, and look, and again, it all comes, you can take a lot of it back to, that pre-season planning. obviously the majority of pre-season is focused on players getting fit, doing whatever they do from that side of it. But I think the best clubs also use a lot of time in pre-season to just kind of plan what the season's going to look like, what are they trying to achieve, to get absolute clarity on it. So, at some point in the season, players are going to struggle, or the team might struggle, or you might have a lot of injuries.
Yeah.
Talk about that pre-season, say, right, when, say we win 3 games on bounce, what are we all going to commit to in the next game? Say we lose 3 games on the bounce. What are we all going to do? What are the potential dangers of that to us as a team? How can
I think what's made it hard watching Bolton this year? I think it's continuity, and obviously, we started off the season under Ever. That wasn't going too well. The change in manager appointment. But I think we went the whole season only twice, sticking with the same lineup. So you're almost like, this player might have had a bad performance, Maybe if we put, a second string player on, next game, see if that works. And nothing ever seemed to continuously improve. It was always either sort of the same standard or even worse in some aspect. So it was very difficult to put your finger on where it was going wrong. Obviously, the forwards at the start of the season, they were scoring, and it sort of hit a flat line. But then, obviously, naturally, you saw, your midfield players having to work harder to get that ball into the strikers. Your wing backs, the change of system. I certainly felt, from the start of the Schumacher appointment, that it was never necessarily going to go his way. Obviously, teams have that natural bounce back most of the time. But I think as a fan watching it from the stands, it was so hard to understand, what had particularly gone wrong, because there were such high expectations. And obviously that was sort of derailed from the very start.
Look, that's a great point. You mentioned before, Bolton got beat by Oxford, then go into the new season and maybe don't have the best of starts. I think it's a huge piece of work there in the closed season about how do you reframe that?
Yeah.
How what do we take out of getting close but just not getting over the line?
Yeah, and I think, Paul, just to jump in, we interviewed the manager, not me personally, spoke to the manager and asked Ian Evatt, the manager at the time, what was the thing that was causing this hangover? And Ian Evatt said, we changed the system because it didn't work against Oxford. We changed it at the start of the season. We tried it, and they were playing 2 10s behind a striker, and it wasn't working. And then I think they had a conversation, the manager and the players, very, very Brian Clough-like at Leeds, but obviously it went a successful way this time, and not obviously with him departing out of the back door. And the players and Ian Evatt came to an agreement that they were going to go back to what had worked before the Oxford game, and there started to be a few results. The manager did actually specifically say, the manager at the time, of course, that the players were still feeling it, and this was around 10 games into the season, and that was when things changed for the better. And then there was again a bit of doubt that set in because results weren't going great again then, and then they reverted back to the philosophy. The system they started the season with, and that's when for me it all started to become very confusing for both the players and the manager, because he's trying to find solutions, and in the end it snowballed into a really tricky period for the manager. In the end he loses his job, and then a new man has to come in, motivate a set of players, and then change a philosophy slightly, and then still achieve a target of playoffs. And in the end Bolton did in the end fail on that front. But just what you were saying then, Paul, about that, the hangover did continue, and that was admitted by the manager, and it forced the manager to make a change. It forced his hand, because obviously in pre-season people weren't able to cope with the failure of Wembley last season.
I think sometimes football's very, very good when something happens, and it will respond immediately when something happens. I think probably where the gains can be found are preventing those things from happening. So what do we do in the pre-season, knowing that potentially the players might have there might be a hangover from the Oxford defeat. So instead of getting to the start of the season and kind of hoping to get a good start, let's make that one of our targets that we're really going to work on, changing the narrative around that game and taking away what we need to take away from it, making sure it's parked. It's not forgotten about, it's not ignored, but we deal with it, it's parked, and then we start the next campaign in a stronger place. Because if you don't really address it, or you don't address it properly, then you've still got those cracks there and those vulnerabilities. And while you're winning, they don't show up.
Yeah.
But as soon as you go on a bit of a losing streak or performances dip, then all those vulnerabilities that haven't been addressed, they reappear. And that's very difficult to turn around then.
How hard is it from sort of, your experience? Obviously, some players obviously won't necessarily come out and say how they're feeling. It's a very protected sort of industry in that sense. But there was numerous times within the media itself, Ian Everett would call the players out. Mentally fragile was a word that was used quite a lot.
Oh, right.
And in terms of obviously, hearing that from either a social media point of view or something that's been passed back to them, and them not necessarily being able to respond. I mean, how does that sort of feedback work in terms of a player understanding that, right, that comment has been made, but not necessarily being able to sort of, express how he might be feeling on the back of that, and then still having to, meet the expectations that the manager has set,
Good question,
for the team that season?
Well, I think with instances like that, and, in general, if a manager comes out and criticises a player or says things that maybe should stay in changing room, you run the massive risk of damaging the relationship and the trust between the players and the manager. And I think once you start to get fractures in that relationship, it's generally just a matter of time when something happens. Because let's not kid ourselves. If a manager said something, every player will know about it. That'll be the talk at changing room. And then it only takes one player to be kind of thinking, oh, what happens if he calls me out next week? Is it going to be me next week?
Yeah, it's been. Listen, Paul, it's been nothing short of a difficult season, because it's been the most turbulent season since pre-League Two. I would say since the old era under the old owner, which the less said there in this moment, the better. But it's Bolton had climbed. They'd got to a position in 9th. They went and got themselves into a good position in the playoff places. Ultimately, failed in the second leg away from home at Oakwell. Following season, they got to the playoff final and lost to Oxford. And that's when fans started to say then that the positive trajectory could only go one other place, and that was top 2, because Bolton, of course, finished 3rd last season. Chris, on everything Paul said, is there anything that's really niggling at you that you can pick from what Paul said and relate back to your own opinions on how the season's gone, or anything to do with things you've always wondered about, but now that you might have a bit more science or cognitive thought around?
Paul, I do wonder, and this is something I relayed to a fellow Bolton fan before this current season had started. In the eyes of some Bolton fans, do you think, because of what had happened in the playoff final, that whatever Ian Everett had done, he could have ended up winning the League One title, the FA Cup, the EFL Trophy, and the FA Cup? And yet, in the minds of some Bolton fans, it would have been irredeemable. Is that a very difficult thing for a manager to have to overcome psychologically?
Just as I say, once the relationship with the players and the manager is broken, it's a matter of when, not if. I also think as soon as the manager loses the fans, that's a very, very tough place for a manager to be.
Yeah.
Just, and look, I'm a football fan myself, so, you talk about managers and performances and things like that. But from a human perspective, they are under a huge amount of stress. And just as with players, you put anyone under huge amounts of stress, they generally can start making poor decisions.
Yeah. So it's induced, yeah.
A lot of the time, when you say, I can't understand why he's made that decision, or why has he made that substitution, or why hasn't he made that substitution, and it might just be the stress of the situation leads to poor decision making.
Yeah, talking about the different stimuli in the ground, Paul, the fans, the players maybe finger pointing at each other. He doesn't want him partnering him at centre half for the last 20 minutes of this, so I'll move him from left back and move him to left centre half, and then I'll bring a left back on, for tactical reasons. But then the fan behind me shouting, well, why are you putting him on? He's only just come back from an injury. It's very difficult then, like you're saying, and devil's advocate here, Paul, and I think that's what you've done really well here. I'm not saying that. You've looked at it from both sides, which I think is important when we're having chats like this. That the manager then actually could be making a substitution based on the fact that he thinks that's what everyone wants him to do, rather than what he actually thinks is best for the side tactically, or even cognitively what he would want to do in that situation based on his own philosophy and his outlook on the game prior to it, and what he was thinking maybe 10 minutes ago.
Yeah, things change so quickly, but you also remember, if a manager's going through a bad trot, or a team's going through a bad trot, the manager's going out there knowing that he might get sacked in 90 minutes. You imagine going into your workplace every day thinking, if I make the smallest mistake here, someone's going to come up and sack me later on today. It is proper pressure. They do have. There is a lot of stress. You've got to manage so many different people. There's so many different dynamics going on. The manager has to be seen as the one who's, the leader in charge and in control. They can't be the ones who seem to be struggling at any point, because everyone else picks up on that. So look, I think it is a very tough role. And like I say, you put people under enough pressure, and maybe you're a manager when you're under loads of pressure in a game, you overthink, and you're tinkering and you're switching this, you're switching that, and in the workplace, it might be like if your manager micromanages you, and that might be how some managers are when they get put under pressure. And that again, it brings on that fear thing. It doesn't help people perform to their best.
What I'd like to do is just ask you to play a little game of fast track psychology with us. And what I mean by that is, if I was to throw a certain scenario to you, could you give us a specific stress management technique, or maybe something that the player could try, or something that any of us could try, whether we play at amateur level or semi-pro level or pro level, or in any sport, for example, to maybe help us? So just a couple of different scenarios. So football, as we've said, is going through a bit of a barren run, not scored for 4 or 5 games, and team are top of the league, but the other team are 3 points behind him, and he's thinking that it's all on him. What would you say to that player?
I'd get them to think about what their 3 key strengths are as a player.
Okay.
And I'd say, right, get about the scoring the goals bit. If you absolutely nail these 3 key things, you'll have a great game. And if you have a great game, the chances are you're going to have a good chance to score. Because all they're doing is thinking about, I've got to score. And they forget to do the things that they're really good at. So I'd just say, right, make sure you're aware of what you are really, really good at. Can you commit to delivering those 3 things?
Amazing, absolutely amazing. How's about a change of manager, Paul? A player is a manager's favourite player, or someone that you believe is in the manager's group, you could say. He's a star man, the fans love him, but he's one of the manager's boys, as fans often allude to. The manager is removed from his duties and a new manager comes in. and that player's now wondering where he sits in the hierarchy of the playing squad. Not that it should matter. How do you settle that player, Paul?
It's a bit of a cliche in psychology, and we talk about it a lot. Control the controllables. You haven't got any control over what the new manager thinks about you, but you have got control over how you conduct yourself, how you behave, how you play, your attitude, and all those things. So I get them just to kind of focus on themselves, and by displaying the best version of themselves, they'll put themselves in the best position to show the manager what they can do, and hopefully get back into good books.
A player's come back from a really bad injury, maybe a cruciate ligament injury, and they are a key player to the team, like Kevin De Bruyne, for example, at City. How do you settle them back into what is a pressurised season, and what are the techniques that you would use to maybe relax them going back into what is going to be a huge demand on them to go and win the league, for example?
Especially during games when they first come back after an injury, they will be they can be apprehensive about a whole host of different things. Just really, really simply, take control of what you can take control of, and I get them a real simple one, just to focus on the breathing.
Amazing.
It just calms them down. It gives them a bit of thinking time. They can think a bit more rationally rather than emotionally, and just get themselves into the game.
Special, Paul. Listen, we'd love to speak to you more going forward. I'd love you to come back on again, Paul. You've been an absolute star. That was Midweek Finalysis, second hour with sports psychologist and chartered psychologist Paul Russell.
Midweek Finalysis with Harlan Dane Fallon, Danny Rowe and Bobby McClellan.
96.